Hello, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 8 game from the Washington Chess Congress. Now, if you followed the round 7 video, you know that I won a thriller against International Master Michael Mollier with black. And this really put me in a great position going into the last 2 rounds because I think I was a half point behind the leaders. And just playing pretty good chess. I'd managed to build up some momentum and was feeling pretty good about where I was. And now I had the white pieces. So I was hoping to really do something with the white pieces to really put me in a good position going into the last round. My opponent in this one was International Master David Brodsky, and that's a name that should be familiar to longtime viewers of the Road to Grandmaster series because he's someone that I've played a few times this year. Now, he's a very, very strong player and actually already has all 3 of his Grandmaster norms. He actually just needs the rating. So he's, I think, maybe about 30 or 40 points away rating-wise, and he'll probably get there. He's very, very talented, and he works very hard at chess, and I'm rooting for him. I'm optimistic that he'll get there, but of course I was not rooting for him to make progress against me in this game. Now, I was white, as I mentioned, so I was going to try and put some pressure on him. And I've actually been able to put some pressure on him with white in the past, albeit he was a much weaker player the last time I had white against him. I remember that I played quite a decent game against him in the Slav a few years back, and that game ended in a draw, but I had the better chances, I believe. And so I was thinking about that game before going to this one, thinking, oh, okay, maybe I can get some pressure on him there. But of course, over time, your openings and your approach changes, and you're not doing the same thing all the time. And so I didn't really expect a total repeat of a game from maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm with d4, and David played knight f6. And that was already kind of a surprise to me because I did kind of think he was more of a Slav type of player. But I had seen him play some Nimzo Indians as well. So again, he's definitely added more to his game. And that's typically the case as you get stronger, is you add a little bit more to your repertoire, especially if you're a young player, because usually young players are able to learn different things quite quickly. So anyways, after knight f6, I played knight f3, in part because I still wanted to kind of, tiptoe around what he was going for, and this actually gives me the most flexibility to kind of determine what structure I want to go to. And now he played e6, and this kind of told me, okay, he's probably trying to go to sort of Nimzo, Bogo, or Queen's Indian type of setup, depending upon the circumstance. Because usually when you play these first few moves and you don't commit with the pawn to d5, you're not going to commit to it on the next move either. And so I kind of narrowed it down here to a Bogo or a Queen's Indian. So now I went for c4, and this was essentially the moment of truth. Which line would he play? And he very quickly trot out the move b6, and there we have it. We have a Queen's Indian defense. And the Queen's Indian has a very, very storied history. It's been played in by many world champions over the years. Karpov is the one that comes to mind the most. This was one of his main weapons against d4, in part because it's so solid. The reason that white is typically slightly better in these lines is because white has a little bit of a space advantage based upon these pawns controlling the center. But black a lot of the times bases their counterplay on a well-timed d5 or c5 break and control of the e4 square. So black is not without counter chances. I played the move g3. This is the most solid approach in my opinion, trying to just get the fianchetto. And I actually mentioned this type of dynamic in the last video, actually, in the game against Michael Mollier, that a lot of the time when you have bishops lined up against each other on the same diagonal, typically it's the one that's actually protected that's actually more secure. And so given the fact that after bishop g2 I'm actually going to castle kingside, there sometimes is some tactical liabilities based upon the bishop on b7 being unprotected. But nothing major, but just something to think about. So anyways, after g3, bishop b7 came on the board. I went bishop b2, and now bishop e7. And bishop e7 is actually the old main line of the king's, excuse me, not the king's Indian, the queen's Indian. It's basically the idea is that black is not going to try to strike out in the center very quickly, and is instead just going to castle and play a little bit modestly until white kind of shows what they're trying to do. The more ambitious way to play, I believe, in some lines is actually to play the move c5. I'm trying to attack the center right away. In fact, in this position, I think bishop b7 and c5 is not so great, because here after d5, I think I might have knight h4, and I can actually just recover the pawn based upon the dynamic of these bishops staring each other on the diagonal. But the main modern line of the Queen's Indian is actually bishop a6, and the point is that after queen c2, now you lash out with c5, and this actually becomes a pawn sacrifice a lot of the time, because after d5, e takes d5, and c takes d5, note black can't take on d5 now because of queen e4 check, which would pick up the rook on a8 or the knight on d5. But after the move bishop b7, white players normally don't defend this pawn. They just play the move bishop g2, and they argue that in positions after knight takes d5 and castles, that white has a lot of counterplay based upon the lead-in development, the half-open d-file, and an eventual e4. And these positions are extremely dangerous to navigate for both sides. So I think David kind of just wanted to go for the more solid approach, because in the bishop b7 lines, it's very difficult to get a losing position straight out of the opening. Because you're basically playing a little bit more solidly, a little less ambitiously. So, anyways, after bishop b7, I castled, and then black did the same. And here I played the move knight c3, and this move is almost always met in the old main line of the Queen's Indian with the move knight e4, challenging the knight on c3 as soon as it gets that square to try to take control of the e4 square and also exchange some pieces. Because again, because white has a slight space advantage, black is comfortable to exchange a few pairs of minor pieces to alleviate that pressure, and then get to an ending where there's more comfort. This was not completely foreign to me, and that's why after knight e4 I actually played the move bishop d2, which is quite common in this position, actually reinforcing the knight on c3 so you don't have to get double pawns. Now I'll show you why the other knight takes e4 is not so attractive, because if you go bishop takes after knight takes and bishop takes e4, now there's a scenario where this bishop is still opposing the one on g2, and whenever the knight moves from f3, black will actually be happy to take on g2 and just play d5 and get a very satisfactory position. And so these types of positions where the bishop winds up trading itself for the light squared bishop gives black a certain solidity, and that's why white is not so keen to take on e4. Now, the other thing to note with the bishop d2 move is, well, doesn't it seem like white is just giving up the bishop pair with knight takes d2? Well, yes, that actually is the case, and knight takes d2 actually is playable, but usually it's not actually played, and the reason for that is because after queen takes d2, white is able to, take the center if they want with the move e4, and because white has such good control of the center, the bishop pair isn't as significant a factor as it would be in other scenarios, although there is latent long-term pressure. Like if black could kind of withstand white's middle game pressure and central control, and maybe plays like d6, rook e8, bishop f8, g6, repositions this bishop on this long diagonal, black, could kind of, have an argument. But in a lot of positions, the space actually matters more. And so that's why black players don't usually play knight takes d2, even though it's an option. Instead, what they normally do is the move bishop f6. And this is the move that David actually played. And the point is that you're actually getting your bishop, you're replacing your bishop on f6 where the knight was, and you're actually preparing c5 in a lot of lines, kind of reinforcing the notion of crippling white's pawn structure, because with the bishop on this diagonal, it's hitting c3 again, but also putting some pressure on the d4 pawn, and c5 would actually cause a crisis in the center where white would have to make a decision on that pawn. So this position was still actually familiar to me, though, and after bishop f6, I played the move knight e5. And this move, actually, I have good memories with because I employed it in a game in 2016 against an international master from Denmark named Martin Hoblo. And that game's actually in the database online, so you can check it out. But it was actually a really, really nice positional masterpiece. And I was basically hoping to get, excuse me, a position similar to the one I'd gotten in that game, even though I could kind of vaguely, I'd only vaguely remembered it because it was 3 years ago. Essentially, that was what I knew about this position. I knew that I can play this knight e5 move, that it forces off a few pairs of minor pieces, which is typically in Black's favor in this setup. Normally they want to trade minor pieces, but I also thought it gave me kind of a risk-free position where I would be able to press a little bit, and so that's why I went for it. And the other thing here is that the next few moves are quite forcing, so you really have to be quite precise. So knight takes e3 was played, very, very important. The knight on e4 was attacked, and you need to take knight takes e3 because it's also hitting the queen on d1, so it's very important you play this. And so now I played bishop takes e3, and then bishop takes g2, getting rid of the tension there. And then after king takes g2, this is actually, maybe the first critical position in the game, and maybe arguably the only critical position in the game, because I again had this position in a game in 2016, and I was only aware of the move d5. This was the move that actually came in the game against Martin in 2016, and I'd actually, against this move d5, I'd prepared the move knight g4, and it wasn't knight g4. I think I did queen d3. And then we had a scenario where there was d takes e4, queen takes d4, queen d5 check, queen takes d5, e takes d5, knight g4, attacking the bishop on f6, bishop e7, knight e3, attacking the pawn on d5, c6, and knight f5. And I was actually able to win a really nice game in this position after the position rook e8, knight takes e7, rook takes e7, and e3, where I was able to get a minority tack on the queen side and simultaneously prepare the move e4, and ultimately it was too much for Black to bear in this queenless middle game. So I was angling to try and get a position similar to this, but unfortunately for me, I didn't know about the other possibilities in this position after king takes g2, and David was very updated on what the modern theory was. And you might say, well, the game was only played 3 years ago. What do you mean modern theory? Wasn't the theory back then modern? Well, the point is that theory is changing all the time, and so for me not to be aware of games in 2017, 2018, and 2019 is a problem if I'm trying to get something out of this line. And so in this position, David actually surprised me with the move c5. And this move, has some real positional grounding because essentially it's trying to undermine my center and also exert some pressure on the diagonal with this bishop on f6. And so it's actually a really, really good move, just asking me some important questions. And one of the annoying things about it is that if I essentially play d takes c5 and then get this bishop with d takes c5 and b takes c5, I wasn't a huge fan of my knight being somewhat pinned to the bishop on c3 because I didn't like structures where bishop takes c3 and b takes c3 were a possibility. And so I thought here Black would probably be fine. And the other thing is that the half-open b file actually gives Black really good counterplay once the rook lands on b8. So I thought Black's next move is probably d6, and then knight c6 and rook b8 comes on the board, and it's hard to imagine that that Black is at all worse, and might even be a little bit better in certain positions if he's able to get some pressure against my b2 pawn. And so, again, this is a position that was completely foreign to me, so I wanted to play relatively safely, and I played, after quite serious thought, I played the move knight g4, which was kind of similar to the the ideas and the line against d5, where I try to take the bishop on f6. Now, there were some other alternatives, so I'll just to be thorough, I'll show some of them. So one of those was rook c1 to protect the pawn, to protect the bishop on c3. But here, white could play d6, knight f3, knight c6. Very important to keep the tension on the d4 pawn instead of resolving it right away, because then white might have a space advantage. And then after e3, cd4, knight d4. It's really hard to imagine there's very much in this position. I think black is pretty much fine. The queen can come to b7 with check if need be. The rooks can come to c8 and d8. And the d6 pawn is really no weaker than the c4 pawn. So I'm not really buying that. There also was the move e3 right away. But here, black could play d5 and equalize based upon the fact that the queen is coming to d5 with check after c takes d5. And again, this type of position, I think, is just totally satisfactory for black. And in fact, I'd have to be a little bit careful here, because with the double pawns and black having this queenside pawn majority, it could actually get a bit dodgy. I guess I'll show you one more possibility after c5 is, well, what if I play d takes c5? Well, if b takes e5, queen d6, trying to kind of, anchor myself on the d6 square, double the rooks on d1 and get pressure on d7, not so fast. Black can play the move queen b6. And the point is that after rook d1 and a trade of queens, my rook is forced away, then my knight is forced away, and then again we have the scenario where black has defended the d6 pawn effectively and is getting pressure on the b file. So I just didn't really buy it. I did not see any circumstance where I was really getting anything serious, and I thought knight g4 was just a solid alternative, which at least got some pieces off the board and kept the control in the position. So after knight g4, some more exchanges came on the board. We had these trades on d4. And then black played the move knight c6, which hits my queen with tempo, and is actually a pretty good move. And a lot of these structures, you don't normally want the knight on c6. You usually want on d7, because it doesn't get in the way of the rook on c8. At least that's typically the concept in hedgehog type of structures. And this is a hedgehog pawn structure for black. But the difference here, and the reason why knight c6 is good, is because there's no bishop on b7, and there's no bishop on b7 that's basically trying to attack the white king, and so it's not like the knight's actually blocking anything here. So why not put it on c6? And then in some lines you actually attack c4 faster. So it makes a lot of sense. After knight c6, I played the move queen d6, and this is essentially my concept, is I was going to try to sort of keep the d-pawn backward as long as possible and build up pressure with rook d1 and rook c1. But now black played the move queen g5. And this is another really, really nice move, because it gets a tempo on the knight on g4. And yeah, I really have, I'm losing time defending a little bit, which is preventing me from consolidating in the center. So I played knight e3. Note that if I play queen takes d7, black can just play queen takes g4, and after queen takes d6, queen takes e2 is more than enough for black to be fine. In fact, this position is actually kind of dangerous for me a little bit, because maybe the rook can come to d8 with some activity, because there's also rook c8 as a threat. So if b3 to stop rook c8 and queen takes c4, black could just play rook a d8, and then now black's the one that's actually controlling the one open file in the position, and that could spell real trouble for white in these types of heavy piece end games. So don't want that. So that's why I played knight e3, because I defend this knight, I defend c4, and I'm threatening queen takes d7. Now black played rook f d8, just defending that pawn. And it seems like black is passive for a moment, but the real issue is that black's very next move is going to be queen c5 if allowed, and that move will force my queen back or force an exchange that will be very favorable, and allow black to just equalize, because if the queens come off the board, the d-pawn can be further defended with king f8 and king e7, and again, I won't be able to get too much pressure once the king gets to e7 and defends this pawn. So to just try and prevent this queen c5 idea, I played the move b4, which is extremely radical in some sense, and quite ambitious, because I'm basically trying to seize a lot of space before anything, before black can try to trade the queens. But the problem is, even this move doesn't really, like, it's not enough, essentially. Like, it's a nice move from aesthetics perspective, just controlling the c5 square, but I'm not in time to get all the moves I want in the position, and that's kind of the problem. The computer actually suggests rook fd1, but again, after queen c5, b3, takes, and king f8, it's just hard to imagine white getting anything here. Although, you know, maybe this would have allowed us to play a much longer game. I'm still skeptical that I have anything, but at least, you know, it would have still kept pieces on the board and been, you know, somewhat complicated. Instead, after b4, black played rook ac8. And this is one of the problems with the move b4, is I do control the c5 square, but now my c4 pawn is a little bit weak, and my e3 knight is kind of tied to it. And it's really hard to make use of my majority when my queen also has to eye the b4 pawn, my knight has to eye the c4 pawn, and it's just hard to consolidate everything. I now went a4, trying to kind of press onward on the queen side. I thought that in some positions, if I can get a5, b takes a5, and then b5 in, I might have a dangerous majority on that side as long as this pawn is on d7. But it's really not the case. Instead, the move rook fd1 was also an interesting option. And the lines here are actually quite unusual. I was always worried about queen e7, but actually the computer says that b5 is actually quite strong here, which seems very, very anti-positional, just giving the knight the a5 square from which it can, you know, block my pawn majority and attack c4. But actually the concept is that after this trade, if you actually go knight a5, rook a d1 is actually extremely dangerous, because now the d7 pawn is still backward and weak, and the king has not yet gotten to e7, so the rook on c5 the rook on c8 has to deal with it. And after rook c7, amazingly, c5 is just a stunning move that gives white a massive advantage, because rook takes e5 is a trade of pawns, but all of a sudden now with the rook threatening mate and getting super active, it's quite dangerous. But the alternative is actually even worse. If you play b takes e5, rook a6 remarkably nearly traps the knight because it can't go forward. And after knight b7, rook takes a7 is pretty much decisive, because b6 will actually win a piece. So yeah, very, very unusual potential sequence, and I think one that, you know, I really just underestimated, this doubling the rooks in the c5 breakthrough, and I think something that really could have happened, because the most natural move to my eyes does seem to be knight a5. So yeah, go figure. Instead, I went a4, and now David played the move knight e7. And I think I mentioned this in the past, because I played him in a Carol Khan in one of these FIDE weekend events recently. And I mentioned in that game that David has a really good way of, like, kind of nullifying pressure and trading pieces when he senses danger. And I think knight e7 is a really good example of that, because in 2 moves he solves his problems. He had the space advantage, right, connected to my queen being on d6, and now he's kind of, and then the other thing he had was this potential queenside pawn majority being a problem. But he kind of kills 2 birds in 1 stone, because now he's actually threatening knight f5, which would, you know, trade pieces and get the knights off the board, and he's in some lines actually undermining the c4 pawn, because once the knight comes off the board, it's actually unprotected. And so it's actually just a really good move, which just simplifies the position in a way where I can't really get any more dynamic chances. I pressed on with the move a5 just because I thought that was the most logical way to play, was to just try and open up the a file at least and get some counterplay there. But now David just played knight f5 anyway, And the point is that after knight takes f5, which I played, and queen takes f5, black has this queen e4 check idea, which will net the c4 or e2 pawn if I'm not careful. And my c4 pawn is now attacked, so I have to be kind of aware. The other kind of disappointing or annoying thing is that if I play a takes b6, after a takes b6, it doesn't really, I can't really take on b6 with the queen because there's queen e4 check, and yeah, black will net one of these very, very important pawns, and the position is actually just equal, but actually a little bit easier to play black, because if I retreat with king g1, now after queen takes c4, e2 is still attacked, and now there's a threat of rook b8 actually challenging the b4 pawn, and black essentially has one pawn island and I have two, so this would be actually quite a tricky position now where black could actually try to play for the win. So yeah, just had to be careful there, yeah, I decided to be extremely careful, not even allow these checks by playing the move queen d3. And this move was actually accompanied by a draw offer by me because I just didn't see any way to kind of, grease the skids in this position. And essentially, when the queens come off the board, this rook endgame is very, very close to drawn. So I really did not see very much here and thought that a draw was going to be the likely result anyway. And why prolong the game another hour, hour and a half when the result really wasn't in doubt, especially against a player of this guy's caliber. He wouldn't mess this up. Again, black quite simply can play a move like queen takes d3, e takes d3, and d5, and pawns are going to come off the board very, very quickly, and the black rooks are going to be active, and the position will just simplify very quickly to a draw. And so to save us the time and energy, and really just kind of acknowledge that it is what it is, David actually accepted that draw, and yeah, that was it. A very short game. Somewhat disappointing that I wasn't able to put more pressure on his position, given the fact that I was white. But I also didn't mind the result, just from the standpoint that I was surprised out of the opening, and I didn't react irrationally. So that was at least a good sign. And yeah, it is what it is. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.